Deborah Shapley had a distinguished 30-year career as a journalist, serving as a reporter for the weekly journal Science and as the Washington bureau chief for Nature. She is the author of 4 books, the best known of which is Promise and Power, The Life and Times of Robert McNamara, published on Little Brown in 1993. She is the granddaughter of Harlow and Martha Shapley and is the writer, editor, and publisher of the online blog Harlow Shapley Project. I found Deborah's recent post about her grandmother, entitled Martha Shapley, Astronomer, fascinating. Martha was a very able mathematician who was instrumental in her husband's early work on galactic structure, and also published papers on her own. But her career was sidelined by the pressures of having 5 children and supporting her husband's role as the director of the Harvard Observatory. Martha Shapley's work and the legacy of women astronomers is the topic of this episode of the interviews. This is the Bang Goes the Universe interview with Deborah Shapley. And Deborah Shapley, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So what inspired you to write about your grandmother and include her in the Harlow Shapley Project?
Well, first, her story has not been really written, and she left few records, and that's partly because she was not self-important. And we know it's important to publish good scholarship about the lesser-known women. She's certainly one of them, it turned out. And second, I knew her since my birth in 1945, and I know that she's hard to convey. And yet I was with them a lot in my youth, obviously, and then later while I was at Radcliffe, and later very often. So I knew them both well together and her separately. So I feel it's just important for me to try to do this.
Sure. Where did they meet, your grandparents?
In calculus class at the University of Missouri.
Of course they did.
in 1909. And Harlow later wrote, and he often would say it exactly this way, in my 3rd year, he's an astronomy undergraduate, but he's in calculus class, I met a brunette named Martha Betts from Kansas City and never got loose or wanted to. We met first in a mathematics class. She sat in the front row and knew all the answers.
That's great. Such a good story. So she was from Kansas City, as you mentioned, and worked as a grade school math teacher for a number of years before going to U of Missouri, where she got her bachelor's degree in 1910. And that was the same year as Harlow.
Yeah.
But they weren't quite the same age. How did that all come to pass?
Well, the Shapleys had acquired a whole bunch of land after the Civil War. So his parentage were farmers, wheat farmers in the southwestern corner in the Ozarks. So he was from a farming family, but they wanted him to get educated. And so he worked in the local towns as a reporter to save money to get to the institute, which amounted to high school, and then the university. They didn't have much money.
Mm-hmm. How did their early lives compare or contrast? Do they have very much in common when they met?
Well, it's interesting that I now realize from doing this post how different it was, because my grandfather had this amazing Ozark accent, and he was still at some level engaged with that type of life, even when we were in New Hampshire later. And her family was really quite sophisticated. They had come from Germany in the 1840s, 2 different branches, and very ambitious, musical, civic, and it's the great bourgeoisie of the Midwest. So her father was in Kansas City. He'd moved down to Kansas City where he was a leader civically.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then she's awarded, they both get their master's degrees at the University of Missouri. And then later she gets, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then she gets awarded a scholarship to study Teutonic languages at Bryn Mawr.
Right.
So she matriculates there. Harlow is already at Princeton, working on his PhD. And he proposes marriage at some point, not too long after. And she accepts and drops out of school to go and marry this guy and move west.
So they were actually dating, what we would call dating. I guess they would call dating after that, since they met at college. And then I guess, I'm not sure what the board, the girls would room with a local person in Columbia and attend the university. So they were together a lot, and he called on her over in her home in Columbia. And the Betzes got to know him. Her sister wrote that nobody was surprised when they got engaged. He had called on the family and made himself very charming. And so
they certainly seem like a perfect match. I mean, looking back on it.
So he then got awarded a fellowship to go to Princeton and study under Henry Norris Russell, very highly recommended. This was a very big deal. So he was there from the fall of 1911, working on the PhD on what later became a very important PhD. And she only arrived at this Bryn Mawr thing in September of 13. And then he was offered this job at Mount Wilson because he was finished up and he was in high demand as a very promising young guy. And so he would have to go west. So he proposed and she accepted, and she went back to Kansas City to prepare to get married.
Wow. So they move west after marriage.
Yes.
And he starts up at Mount Wilson Observatory, which at the time hosted two of the largest and most technically capable telescopes in the world at the time, including the 100-inch telescope. Well, it was the 100-inch
wasn't around. The
100-inch would come toward the end of his career there, frankly, and doesn't see first light until 17. But they spend 7 years there, this dynamic duo of sorts. And it's basically her math and his vision, which.
Well, in his math, let's not.
In his math, of course. Yeah, but generally they both share this. But she, in the first years that they're there, publishes several works on astronomical problems centered around his work on eclipsing binaries and variable stars. Those would have been Cepheids in the early going, and later our Lyrae variables would have been a big part of his globular cluster work. And he even ends up crediting her on a couple of his later papers on the galactic structure series. That was so groundbreaking.
Yes. Well, I would say the first one of the big surprises in my research, and one reason I hope people will use the article, which is heavily sourced, footnotes available on request, and complete bibliography and slideshow about eclipsing binaries, for which I'm very grateful to Chief Canai for doing it. The point is, she has 14 bylines in that period, of which many are duplicates because one paper was published twice by custom, as you well know. But these are thorough, good papers of drawing the light curves of the variable stars. And several of those are co-authored with Harlow as first author. And they include the two of the great papers, number 13 and 14.
Yeah. What's the state of play at Mount Wilson at that time?
Well, as you have written, and I said in the post, women were not allowed to observe because it was considered unseemly, and the mountaintop was for guys, and I don't know, a lot of reasons. I think he got her up there a few times because who wouldn't? They loved hiking, and he took the trail up, sometimes with the burro, That's why his memoir is called Rugged, Through Rugged Ways. So they loved hiking. They would have gotten up there. And she did say she did a little observing, but mainly she worked as a computer, making the reductions and doing the math and writing papers on individual systems, including eclipsing binaries, her specialty. So she could not observe officially, and she could not be paid. And you, Ron, have written very well, and I quote you about this, and also Yun Joan has done work on this. There was no policy against paying women, but it just wasn't done. So she was a volunteer assistant. And there were other women, such as Hannah Pettit, who was also a volunteer for many years. They were just, they could have the use of the equipment in the offices, but they were welcome to work from home.
Right. Most welcome in the case of the brilliant wives of so many of these astronomers. And the position of the leadership at Mount Wilson versus Harvard, what have you learned about that?
Well, it's my understanding, first of all, that, well, we all know that Edward Pickering worked out in the late 19th century that the work of classification could be done very effectively by computers reading off of the photographs and plates.
This is, if I may, this is just to let the audience know, this is
sure.
the early era of stellar spectroscopy. So John Herschel has developed photography, and William Huggins and his wife, who was a great observer, had started the whole process of using spectroscopy to start to determine radial velocities and other aspects of stars, and they began to classify them. And so Edward Pickering, who became the director at Harvard, started this. And I'm sorry to cut you off there. I just wanted to inform the audience.
Sorry, I know we talk so much, it's hard to remember to.
Right. Yeah.
So the Harvard College Observatory, under the directorship of Edward Pickering, employed women computers, they were called, and they were some of them very, very notable astronomers, which Ron will tell us about in a minute, because he can fill in the names and dates. And it's really, really important. The more chance you gave to women to observe and analyze, the more they did. However, at Mount Wilson, the idea was not to classify everything in the sky. Mount Wilson didn't have that capability. They only brought on their best optical telescope for stars, stellar work, Northern Hemisphere, in 1906, I think.
1908.
George Ellery Hale was doing astrophysics, and that was mostly an analytic male, and then male astronomers did that. They had less need for the women computers. And I don't know, I get the impression that the attitudes at Mount Wilson were very what we would consider old-fashioned.
More old-fashioned for sure, and getting a later start, of course. And Hale, if Pickering was interested mainly in stellar classification, building volumes, Herschelian work, of cataloging these things so people could use them to compare and contrast in the future. And Hale and his organization much more centered on stellar evolution, which then evolved into galactic evolution and universal evolution in the future. But so the slightly different, as you say, slightly different mission. And of course, Mount Wilson got started, I don't know, two or three decades later. At least 2 decades later. And so, but with the same kind of old-fashioned attitude in Hale's case, and that lasted until, it lasted. It wasn't, as we've said, it's not like flipping a switch, right? You had Louise
Yes.
Ware and Beatrice Mayberry at Mount Wilson, and Wilhelmina Fleming and Annie Jump Cannon starting the classification system at Harvard. Henrietta Swan Leavitt with her Cepheid breakthrough. That in and of itself should have been enough to just open the floodgates. And then Cecilia Payne, later Koposhkin, comes in, and she writes this dissertation on hydrogen and stars that is, it's fundamental. It's probably the greatest dissertation ever presented to anyone. And Harlow's first, I'm sure you mentioned this, but Harlow's first grad student. And throughout all this, here's Martha Shapley working on being a part of the design of this galactic structure work that Harlow's involved in.
Well, yes, and but to give her the papers at Mount Wilson include her own analysis of different eclipsing binaries and the Lyrae stars, and I think we have a slide of that because she collaborated with Margaret Harwood at Harvard, who sent her the data from the plates. So as you say, there was a flow back and forth because the Harvard operation was designed to be able to be shared in certain ways. So Mount Wilson could build on Harvard work, and there was quite a lot of interchange. As for the women, I would disagree a little bit. I think you're blending epochs. But when you leap to Cecilia in 1925, and we're back with Martha in 1914, if we go back to the teens, that there, as Yun Jo-an has written, there were very few women at Mount Wilson. They were not allowed to have jobs. And I had this quote that doing astronomy was considered unseemly for a married woman. And I like that because it makes my grandmother kind of a rebel. Okay, I'll do this at my table at home. So in her quiet way, she was very productive. So I'd like to point out to our listeners that the women's studies could include more comparisons of co-authorship because he co-authored with her and she co-authored with others, and he co-authored with a number of his women assistants. And if you leap ahead to the 20s, let's not forget Adelaide Ames, who was, I think, his second hire and in her late 20s. And Shapley and Ames together classified the galaxies, including that were then known, the brightest ones, including the Hubble system, in a few years. And the Shapley-Ames catalog is one of the great things. So things changed, I think, in the 20s at Harvard because Shapley was a little bit more liberal. So it'd be interesting to compare when the women got credit.
Yeah, it's great you mentioned Adelaide Ames. She's a star of some of my stories as well, and a tragic story. But at the same time, they did make that compelling volume. Yeah, I think my point about Koposhkin was along the lines of, is talking about whether or not things are improving. And I think we can say that they may slowly have been improving. But as we said, it's not flipping a switch. It's not everybody going, hey, everybody gather around. Look, we think we're missing something here, right? It's hell no. And then,
the way that I think about it is not to renounce judgment that we would be apt to make, but to remember that the Wright brothers flew their plane in, I can't remember when, and Henry Ford invented these are people, Harlow and his generation are from the late 19th century. They are not 21st century people. Yeah. And one sort of issue, I think, in some of the studies is that we project what we wish they were. And every time you find, such as the credits to women, you get all excited because you think, Oh, the men are like us now, but anyway,
Yeah,
I think we've understood. Let's quickly mention Margaret Harwood. She advanced and was the became named director of Maria Mitchell Observatory and had a position at Harvard half the year. She visited Mount Wilson in 1915, other Western observatories, and met Martha, who Harlow invited this noted woman astronomer, to their home. And Margaret Harwood was very impressed with Martha's patience and talent, and everything was very nice. And it was only when Harlow was driving Miss Harwood back to wherever she was, that he explained that his wife had given up pursuing her PhD to marry him, come west, but she was learning astronomy and does the light curves by herself. So he was very proud of her, but she didn't, I think, didn't do a lot of discussion of that while the lady was.
Didn't dwell on it. Yeah. I've asked you before about that, whether that was out of shyness or deference to her husband. And I guess maybe we'll never know. I think deference more than anything. But you've said to me that she wouldn't have been someone who led by example, or she would have been someone who led by example, not being out front of things necessarily, but
yes, they were a good
driver.
She'd married a guy who liked being out in front, and she was there patiently managing things. And she had 3 small children in those 7 years. So
right. So let's move on then with MBS to the directorship at Harvard, which Harlow begins to assume in 1921, we'll say, and they move to the director's house. And they're there for 30 years. And 30 years. I said 30. I didn't say it well enough, probably. Anyway, she, in the early going, she publishes in the Harvard Bulletin, right? The Observatory Bulletin. So what caused her to put the work down, if she did?
Well, they arrived to this residence that had been built in the late 19th century, and that Edward Pickering, who was director for decades, had personally expanded at his own expense, and was on the hill of the observatory and connected to the offices and the computer room and the telescope, the great refractor. And she had 3 small children, they did at that time. And my Aunt Mildred writes about arriving at the campus there and how fascinating it was for the children to tear all over the place. And then these people come through like Annie Cannon, whom they adored, Annie Cannon. And then funny, the people who, and so Martha began, and Harlow wanted to have everybody over. So Martha began managing both the household, the family, and the visits by the observatory staff and music evenings. She was a very proficient pianist. And there just was not a lot of time. I argue that she influenced astronomy by being the hostess and the manageress of this operation. Their guests included, Chandrasekhar, I can't hardly say the name right, Lemaitre.
Chandrasekhar, yeah.
And Short stayed. I mean, there were many guests, visiting scholars, and everybody was invited for the tea or the evening. Mm-hmm. And sandwiches had to be prepared by some person, including Martha, but others. And a good time was had by all, dancing, charades, and so forth. And Harlow worked from the residence as well as 2 offices on the campus. And he went back and forth. So the whole thing was one, it was like being a college, what we would think of today as a college house situation. Everybody is sort of flowing in and out. So I don't think there was that much time. She did continue. She enjoyed the math, especially.
Yeah. You think she regretted not having done more?
I think later she wished she had been able to pick it up more robustly. I don't think in the early years of their arrival, there was a lot of appetite for trying to do astronomy herself. But you see, that's my point about her contribution. Besides her own contributions while at Mount Wilson and a bit later, she aided astronomy in this era by enabling all of this intellectual excitement at campus.
Right. Instrumental in that regard,
Play it another way. Say Harlow had married an introvert or somebody who couldn't deal with being a more public situation, and she adjusted to it and helped.
Yeah. I mention it because I wonder, because of this this quote from your blog that I found in your blog. It's not from your blog. It's from Princeton, the Alumni Weekly in 1964. And I want to read it for the audience so they can hear it too. So bear with me while I fumble through this. It says, quote, "Mrs. Shapley feels some regret at not having accomplished more on her own. She is not the kind of woman who can be wholly satisfied with credit for having helped her husband. She believes that a woman born with gifts, and she obviously was, has an obligation to use them, and not solely in her capacity as wife and mother." So, is this her, or what's going on here? It's not written by her, it's in the third person, but I'm just wondering what's going on, what's happening here.
The Princeton alumni were interviewing them in the mid-60s. By then, they were living mostly in New Hampshire. He was going around the world, being world famous and lecturing and so on. And she had plenty of time, more time, not a lot, but more time to reflect. And I think in this later phase of her life, she realized maybe she should have pushed ahead more, even in the 50s. But let's just remember that she took a job at MIT in a computational lab during the war from 1942. The lab was classified and computed ballistics for the trajectories for the Navy. And she took the trolley down there basically full-time during World War II. There were no students on campus, so there weren't parties and things like that. The place was kind of, and then she worked with Zdeněk Kopal on eclipsing binaries during the later 40s to some extent. So she pursued, she gave her service to the country, her math skills, for a very long time. And then she also continued her research. At some point, she might have realized, well, I'd really like to have done more.
Sometimes we get centered on one aspect of a person's life, and what's great about these interviews is you draw so much more, the dynamics around living a life. It's amazing to find these things out. It's one of the reasons I love my job. So I just have to say, and this, I guess, lends itself to the last remark I made. I see her, I read about her, and I see what you've written in your post. And I see a woman, a sublime, intelligent, patient, graceful, wise. She's obviously got great technical skills. She's got artistic ability. And she manages to counter all of that with copious amounts of what appears to be humility. I'm just wondering, is that how you see her?
Oh, yes, she's very restrained, shy, patient, and I would add correct. let's go back to the German household, the German descended household in Kansas City. And in my post, I have one of her German grandmothers in her black outfit in a chair in this thing that we would think of as a costume, but was what proper gentle lady or whatever would wear. And my grandmother was very much a straight back type. You came to dinner on time, everybody did chores. So when, for example, Miss Astronomer Harwood came, she would have made sure things were correct. And that was part of managing a household, giving the children discipline, do your chores. So I think there was a lot of structure there that was part of her heritage, and she did carry through with it.
Sure. You open and close your piece with this bit about her being regarded as the first lady of the Harvard College Observatory. But the title of the post is actually Martha Shapley, Astronomer. Would she agree with that title?
Given the company that she was destined to keep, I think she would not say she was an astronomer, because she had not observed, she had not done original discovery at the cutting edge through observation, and she's in the company, as you mentioned, of Annie John Cannon, Cecilia Payne, these other people, other women, as well as the outstanding astronomers of the age, including her husband. And I don't think she would have thought, and she didn't have the PhD. Let's just come back to this problem that even many of the women of the era did actually have a PhD by the time they even worked as computers. Yeah. But she had no path to get a PhD out there in California. Mm-hmm. And she took some correspondence courses. And then when she got to Harvard, she didn't have time to start on some Teutonic philology or math or astronomy path. So in our family, to not have the PhD was a big deal. That's just the way it was. So mm-hmm. I think she would not have said, but Ron, you have written, and I quote you saying that the work of analysis done by what we call computers is analytic and cutting edge in the sense that the observations are recorded and shared and important things learned. And that's astronomy by our definition.
Absolutely astronomy, no doubt about it. And I don't know if we've said this, but I've said it many times. There are not a great number of people working on any given project. I remember my research, so much of my research, especially in the early days, was on Milton Humason. And, he didn't just make the computations and then publish. They were published based on his work, but the computations of a computer that he worked very closely with. In fact, two in some cases. And then when he was working with Mayle at the Lick and they were interchanging ideas, Lick had computers working on them. So you get a number of different answers. They're close, and then you weigh the mean and you publish that. And you even talk about that as you're publishing. So it is instrumental in the work of astronomy, as you say, for sure.
Yes, and that's why, just to stick with her influence, that theme, a great amount of the astronomical work that I've seen, and you know this better than I, is done by this communication in advance of publication. Yeah, and sure. And that was why the interchanges on one campus of people at different levels who could buttonhole each other over sandwiches and tea. You could call that a party, but you could also say, this is a teaching operation here. Mm-hmm. I have this problem with my tables on the library stars. So here's Henry Norris Russell on the lawn. I'll ask him,
Right. Right. Incredible. Along those lines, maybe backing up a little bit to demeanor, you turned me on to a photo of Harlow and Martha on the Greek liner Olympia, heading to or from Europe, I don't know which. And you told me that you really like this photo of your grandmother. And can you talk about that a little bit? Tell our audience why you
Well,
like it.
Martha Shapley was shy and she didn't want to be in the spotlight. And how much I sat through where she's patiently there and he's lecturing and making jokes, and, everybody's sort of in awe of this guy. And she's, the perfect wife there. So people went back and forth to Europe a lot. And this was taken on, I don't know what trip, but of course, part of the ocean liner deal is the dinner with the captain and the VIPs on the, first night or maybe every night. So she's in her gown, or a gown with a shawl, and I think looking great. And he's behind
Indeed.
her. And then the Greeks, or the Greek captain and everybody, are in their outfits greeting the guests, and the flashbulb has gone off. And Lana Turner would have known what to do. But my grandmother is turning away and looking down, and that's just what she did.
Yeah, it's telling, right? For
and characteristic. Yeah.
You were a young girl when they were still at the residence, and sort of grew up around
Very
them.
small.
Yeah. Any memories? Any great classic Shapley story from your days at the residence?
Well, I was very small, but the older cousins were allowed to go sledding because the hill used to be very steep, and the people of Cambridge the kids would sled, and that was very exciting. But I remember the little music room, which was very ornate and too small really to hold the music house. And I remember the big room and the piano, and that there was always music. There's a photo, which I guess we won't be showing, but it's a common one. It's on one of my posts of the Shapley Family Orchestra a few years later. My grandmother's usually at the piano, and that one, she's with my Uncle Lloyd, who's playing, and she's turning pages.
Right. Harlow seems like, and I have read a lot and studied a lot about Harlow, his wry wit, clever sense of humor, background in journalism, a great storyteller, as was his friend and mentee, Milton Humison. And there's a yearbook photo of your grandparents. And under Harlow's picture, there's it talks about the telescope as being a telescope gun, quote, aimed at the blooming stars. Was that his sense of humor showing through there, the family spirit, or is that how?
It's the way people in the country talk, and he thought it was fun to make the play about the gun and the stars and blooming. They corresponded in Greg's shorthand, and one reason we're never going to know exactly what Martha contributed is that their co-working papers, the few that exist in the archives, are partly in this shorthand that they both corresponded in. But the few documents where he had to write it out for someone who didn't know Greg shorthand, like his expense account, he's got all these sayings, gosh almighty, da-da-da,
So how's your Greg shorthand?
Non-existent. That's a rabbit hole I decided not to go down. But I did order off the internet a guidebook for the business executive or secretary.
And
if you can see that, And the vocabulary that's expected, that is just a few strokes each word, is astonishing. I won't.
So this is an entire dictionary of words with the Greg shorthand beside it, and you had to learn this.
3 columns on each page. 3 columns on each page. Yeah.
It would take you forever to work through that book to try to find a word you weren't sure of, a symbol you weren't sure of.
The symbols are based on letter groups.
Okay.
I don't think it's phonetic exactly, but it's close. So,
okay. Wow. Okay, so the family corresponds in Greg shorthand, and then I guess I heard Martha's older sister, Annette, or Nettie, as the family nickname goes, said that Harlow and Martha at one point worked out the translation of an astronomy article from Chinese to English. Any ideas as to how they figured that out? I mean,
no, but they loved puzzles.
Wow. I mean, your family reads like a who's who in American math and sciences over the last 100 years, you know. Your grandmother's father, Carl Betts, was an educator who earned high honors at both the Paris and Chicago World's Fairs in 1889 and 1893, respectively, for his pioneering work in physical fitness, of all things. Your grandfather, Harlow, was this groundbreaking astronomer and observatory director. Your aunt, Mildred Shapley, was the editor of no less than 30 definitive volumes of planetary science. Your uncle Alan was vice chair of the International Geophysical Year and a scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Your uncle Lloyd Shapley was just a Nobel Prize winning mathematician. And your father Willis was deeply enmeshed in the creation of NASA, number 3 at that group during the Apollo program, and was brought back out of retirement to fill that role again after the Challenger tragedy, to help put the organization back together again. It is quite a family history. Did you ever feel pressure to live up to that potential?
Is that a trick question? That's a trick question.
Yeah, a little bit. But you had growing up in that environment had to be incredible. Maybe
well, I think one of the advantages of many was the stability of all of them and the cohesiveness with Greg's shorthand or tramping through the woods or looking at the sky or whatever. Or my grandmother's German tradition of coffee and cookies at 11 a.m. But why did the children do so well? Their children, I think, because of this environment where they were expected to be part of a larger group. I love that Willis and Alan, as boys, were told to help the public come to the great refractor at Harvard on public viewing nights. Harlow believed in popular knowledge of astronomy and arranged these public viewing nights. So the old stairs there going up to the dome, a very enclosed environment, and little Willis and Alan are in their suits helping the public. And then they also were to answer questions. And that space is not that large, but I can just imagine the 2 boys. And they could answer questions about the sun and the moon and the planets very easily. But they were told that if one of the members of the public asked something they didn't know, they could say, astronomers don't know the answer yet.
Right.
So the boys, were part of this, the girl, right, we're all.
Right. Final question, I'll give you the last word, and that is very simple. How do you see her legacy? Martha Shapley's legacy.
Well, I hope my post adds to the literature of women in astronomy and to Mount Wilson's record of this. That was, I think, the big surprise was how much she did and how she fits into that story. But I also think that she was determined to contribute to knowledge And when the stars changed and she couldn't go on with original research, she contributed as, quote, First Lady, because as an intellectual herself, continuing to read and be current with, she could have the dialogues, understand what people were talking about, was interested, and was really an excellent manager and intellectual addition to the 30 years at the Harvard Observatory. To me, that helps astronomy.
Deborah Shapley is the writer and creator of the Harlow Shapley Project. And I encourage everyone to go to harlowshapley.org and check it out. It's a very interesting and well thought out site with a lot of great information about the early history of 20th century astronomy, both the men and the women. And Deborah, I want to thank you again very much for showing up and doing this interview with me. It was great.
Thank you very much. It was an honor.
This concludes my interview with Deborah Shapley. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember to like or subscribe to the show for updates on future episodes as they're published. We really appreciate the support. If you have any questions or comments about or for current or future episodes, please leave them in the comments section or email them to me at contact@ronvoller.com. Bang Goes the Universe is written, produced, and hosted by me, Ron Voller. Thanks to Mark Voller for providing the theme music. See you next time.